500 years ago, a man was hung by his twisted arms 6 times in a row. The torture was called strappado. Your body gets hoisted up by the wrists tied behind your back until your shoulders pop out of their sockets. 6 times they lowered him. 6 times they pulled him back up. He didn't confess, because there was nothing to confess. They stripped him of everything. Titles, status, his job, and shipped him off to rot on the family farm. And there, covered in mud, drowning in debt, still carrying the memory of dislocated shoulders, he sat down at a rough wooden table and wrote a book that rewired the Western understanding of power for the next 5 centuries. His name was Niccolo Machiavelli, and the uncomfortable truth he encoded in those manuscripts has been distorted, softened, and deliberately buried for 500 years. Because power doesn't survive when ordinary people start understanding how it actually works. What Machiavelli discovered wasn't political theory. It was a diagnosis of life itself. By the end of this, you'll see every relationship you've ever had, every failure, every betrayal, through a lens so precise, it'll feel like someone finally flipped a light switch in a room you've been stumbling through your entire life. December 10th, 1513. A 44-year-old man is sitting in a Tuscan village called Sant'Andrea in Percasina, about 6 miles south of Florence. Just 14 months ago, he was the secretary of the Florentine Republic, a diplomat who negotiated with kings, commanded the militia, and looked the most dangerous men in Italy dead in the eye. Then the Medici came back to power. He was accused of conspiracy, arrested, subjected to strappado, released, stripped of every title, exiled, and this is where most people would break. This is where any normal person would give in to bitterness, self-pity, and a slow fade into obscurity. But Machiavelli did something different. In a letter to his friend Francesco Sforza, he described his daily routine. Mornings, managing a crumbling estate, haggling with woodcutters over a handful of coins. Afternoons, the local tavern, playing cards with the butcher and the miller. Shouting matches during the games so loud the neighboring villages could hear them. Petty, crude, way beneath anything he'd ever been. But then evening came, and this is where the letter stops being autobiography and becomes revelation. He wrote, "When evening falls, I return home and go into my study. At the door, I take off my everyday clothes, covered in mud and dirt, and put on royal and courtly garments. Dressed appropriately, I enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where, received with kindness, I feast on the food that is mine alone and that I was born for." Listen to that again. A man covered in mud, humiliated by fate, tossed to the margins. But the moment he walked into that room, he refused to be a nobody. He dressed for the occasion. He treated his conversations with dead philosophers like the most important date of his day. And in that room, stripped of wealth, status, and power, he wrote The Prince, a book that rewired the Western understanding of power, human nature, and reality itself. And right there, stripped of everything, he arrived at a principle that explains why some people come back stronger after a hit, while others shatter for good. Why should this matter to you? Because Machiavelli's own life is the first lesson of his philosophy. He wasn't theorizing about hardship from a palace. He was writing a survival manual at the exact moment life was actively trying to destroy him. And here's a detail almost everyone misses. He didn't just read books in the evenings. He had conversations with the authors, wrote down objections, asked questions in the margins, argued. This wasn't passive studying. This was a mind refusing to surrender. And the first principle he pulled from that work? Life doesn't reward kindness. It rewards precision. Not the precision of aim, the precision of perception. The ability to see people, systems, and yourself without the comforting distortions you layer over reality because the truth without them is just too uncomfortable. Most people die without ever developing this ability. They live inside a story that loyalty gets rewarded, that effort gets recognized, that the universe has some kind of built-in sense of fairness. Machiavelli called these people raw material for other people's ambitions, not out of hatred, but because with cold, surgical accuracy, he observed how the world actually runs. And it runs on a logic that has absolutely nothing to do with fairness. Machiavelli is sitting in that same room, flipping through Livy, And he jots down in the margins one of his most disturbing observations. All men are wicked by nature and will only behave properly when they're forced to. Most people flinch at those words. It sounds cynical, extreme, misanthropic, but he wasn't making a moral statement, he was making an engineering one. Think of it like gravity. Gravity isn't evil. It doesn't hate the person who falls off a cliff. It just acts. It's a force. And if you understand it, you can build bridges, airplanes, skyscrapers. If you deny it, the ground doesn't get any softer for you. Human selfishness is the psychological equivalent of gravity. It's not a flaw, it's the engine. When Machiavelli said people are wicked, what he meant was this. Every single person, under enough pressure, will put their own survival, their own comfort, their own status above yours. Not because they're villains, because that's how they're wired. And those exceptions you're clinging to, the friend who'd never betray you, the partner who loves without conditions, Machiavelli would answer coldly and precisely. You just haven't applied enough pressure yet to test that theory. There's no bitterness in that. There's freedom. Because the moment you accept this principle, you stop being shocked by the predictable. You stop blaming people for acting according to their nature. And you start building a life on a foundation that can actually hold the weight, not on the shifting sand of other people's promises. Florence got this lesson in real time. The Medici ruled the city for 6 decades, through a mix of cultural patronage and financial manipulation. When Charles VIII of France invaded Italy with an army of 30,000, Medici power collapsed overnight. Piero de' Medici, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, handed over the Florentine fortresses without a fight, desperately trying to save his own skin. Citizens who'd been singing the Medici's praises for decades turned on them within hours. The palace was looted, the family driven out. Nobody remembered the art they'd funded or the festivals they'd thrown. The mechanism of self-interest kicked in, and decades of loyalty evaporated like morning fog. Machiavelli was 25 when he watched this happen. He never forgot. And neither should you. Every person in your life is loyal to the conditions that make that loyalty convenient. Change the conditions, and you'll see what was real and what was theater. This doesn't mean you can't trust anyone. It means you need to understand the architecture of trust. Trust isn't a feeling, it's a structure. And like any structure, it needs maintenance, inspection, and an honest acknowledgement that no material lasts forever under enough pressure. How many relationships in your life have you never truly tested, and you just take their strength on faith? This is where Machiavelli's philosophy breaks from every motivational speech you've ever heard. He didn't believe you could become anything you want, didn't believe in unlimited potential. He believed in something far more dangerous and far more useful. Life is a war between two forces, and your entire fate depends on which one you feed. The first force he called Virtù. For centuries, this word has been mistranslated as virtue. It's not virtue. Virtue is effective power, a fusion of skill, cunning, decisiveness, energy, courage, and strategic intelligence that lets a person impose their will on circumstances. The quality that builds empires and lifts up the condemned. The muscle that pushes back against chaos. The Latin word virtus itself comes from vir, man, a human being. Virtue in Machiavelli isn't moral purity. It's the power to act. The ability to stop waiting for a favorable wind and start rowing. The second force he called Fortuna. Not luck in the modern sense. Fortuna is a blind, indifferent, destructive current of events that no person controls. Disease, economic collapse, the accident of birth, a betrayal you never saw coming, an opportunity that showed up 10 years too late. Machiavelli compared Fortuna to a flooding river, savage, unpredictable, capable of sweeping everything in its path. And here's the part that should keep you up tonight. He argued that Fortuna controls roughly half of all human affairs. Half. Half of your life. The outcome, the result, the final score is completely beyond your control. No amount of discipline, planning, or genius changes that. But the other half belongs to Virtù, and that half is the one that decides everything. Most people waste their Virtù, their actual ability to act, on things that don't matter at all. Arguing with strangers online, relationships that have been dead for years, a career they chose to get someone else's approval, habits that fill time but build nothing. And then, when Fortuna strikes, when the flood comes, they've got nothing left. No levees, no reserves, no structure. They're standing out in the open, begging the river to be kind. The river is never kind. Machiavelli's message is surgically precise. You can't control what happens to you, but you can control whether you're ready for what's coming. The difference between those two sentences is the difference between a life that's lived and a life that's endured. Francesco Sforza understood this. Born into a family of mercenaries in 1401, he had no wealth, no title, no noble blood. But he had virtue, raw, relentless strategic force. Over decades of warfare, political scheming, and ruthless alliance building, he made himself the Duke of Milan. Not through inheritance, through action, applied at the exact moment Fortuna cracked the door open. He watched, he waited, and when the gap appeared, he moved with such speed there was no room left for retreat. His power lasted because it was earned. Compare that to those who inherited their position, who had power handed to them by circumstance, and you'll see the pattern Machiavelli documented across centuries of Italian history. Power that is given is always taken back. Power that is built lasts. What does that mean for you? Stop praying for better circumstances. Start building the internal architecture that makes you dangerous, regardless of what's happening around you. The goal isn't to control the storm. The goal is to become the kind of person who walks through storms and comes out the other side harder. In chapter 18 of The Prince, Machiavelli wrote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be, but few can sense what you truly are. And those few don't dare challenge the opinion of the majority." That's not a line about deception. That's a line about the fundamental operating system of human society. We live in a world of surfaces. People don't judge you based on your inner reality. They judge you based on the signals you put out. Your posture, your tone, your consistency, the stories other people tell about you when you're not in the room. And here's the scary truth. The signal often outweighs the substance. Machiavelli noticed, a prince should appear merciful, faithful, humane, sincere, and devout, and actually be all those things when he can. But when the situation demands otherwise, he must be able to switch to the opposite in an instant, not because morality doesn't matter, but because rigidity in a world of constant change is a death sentence. This is where people have gotten him wrong for 500 years straight. They think he's advising hypocrisy. He's advising adaptability. Take Agathocles of Syracuse, the son of a potter who became the tyrant of one of the most powerful cities in the ancient world. Machiavelli breaks him down in chapter 8 of The Prince with ice-cold analysis. Agathocles rose through murder, betrayal, and calculated cruelty. He won. He held power for decades. And yet Machiavelli says his victories can't be credited to Virtù. Why? Because the methods Agathocles used destroyed the very fabric of trust needed for long-term, sustainable power. He won every battle, but couldn't fall asleep without guards at the door. He ruled, but never governed. The lesson cuts clean. You can lie, manipulate, and brutalize your way to the top. Plenty of people have. But you'll spend the rest of your life propping up that lie. The energy cost of constant deception is catastrophic. Sooner or later, the mask fuses to your face, and you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Machiavelli's real advice is subtler and deeper. Become the kind of person who doesn't need to fake competence, but who understands the world reads surfaces, and so make sure the surface accurately reflects the depth beneath it. In your life, this translates into one principle that'll save you a decade of confusion. Stop trying to be understood, start being undeniable. People who spend years explaining themselves, justifying decisions, defending choices, proving their worth, they're playing the completely wrong game. In the real game, results talk. In the real game, demonstrated competence rules. Show up with such relentless consistency that surface and substance become one and the same. When there's no gap between what you project and who you are, you become something very rare. A person who can't be destabilized by exposure because there's simply nothing to expose. In Book 1 of the Discourses, Machiavelli describes a pattern that'll trouble you, because you'll recognize it in your own life. Every republic, every empire, every system of power follows a cycle that's nearly impossible to escape. Strength creates order. Order creates prosperity. Prosperity creates comfort. Comfort creates weakness. Weakness creates collapse. And from the rubble, a new cycle begins. Machiavelli didn't invent this idea. The Greek historian Polybius described a similar cycle centuries before him. But Machiavelli added what Polybius was missing: the engine driving the cycle. Human nature itself. The same ambition that builds an empire eventually corrodes it. The same hunger that drives the founder devours his grandchildren. Rome didn't fall because of barbarians. Rome fell because Romans stopped being Romans. Luxury replaced austerity. Entertainment replaced civic duty. Bread and circuses pushed out the discipline that built the republic. By the time the external threat showed up, the internal rot had already done the job. Machiavelli watched the same script devour Florence, Venice, Milan, Naples, over and over, as if the screenplay had been written before the actors were even born. Now, your life. Think about the last time you felt like everything was finally falling into place. Work's going well, money's coming in, relationships stable. And that's exactly when you stopped working out, stopped learning, stopped asking questions. You drifted. And the moment you started drifting, the river rose. Machiavelli saw this play out in every city in Italy, and he'd see it in your life right now. His solution is one of the most paradoxical in all of philosophy. He argued that conflict is essential for health. In the Discourses, he put forward a radical idea. The constant clashes between the Senate and the common people in the Roman Republic weren't a weakness. They were the source of Roman greatness. Friction kept the system alive. Tension prevented rot. Applied to your life, the struggle you're running from, that's exactly what's keeping you sharp. The discomfort you hate, that's the immune system keeping the tissue from decaying. The argument you're avoiding, that's the conversation that might save the relationship. Comfort isn't a reward. Comfort is the beginning of the end. In Machiavelli's writings, one word comes up with almost religious frequency: necessita. Necessity. He argued necessity is the greatest sculptor of human character. When a person is comfortable, they reveal nothing about themselves, because nothing is being demanded. But put that same person under real pressure, take away the safety nets, force them to act or die, and for the first time, you'll see who they actually are. That's why the greatest leaders, the sharpest minds, the most dangerous strategists, almost all of them were forged in deprivation, not in privilege. It wasn't talent that set them apart. Necessity burned away every option except one: be perfect. In the Discourses, he wrote, "Sometimes the greatest wisdom is to pretend to be a fool." Not because foolishness is a good strategy, but because when the world underestimates you, when they've written you off, when the pressure to perform is lifted, you're given something priceless. Time. Time to build without interference. Time to observe while staying invisible. Time to prepare for the moment when you step off the sidelines and onto the center of the board. Machiavelli lived this himself. For 14 years after his exile, he wrote, studied, attended gatherings of Florentine intellectuals in the Orti Oricellari gardens, wrote comedies, composed poetry, and sharpened the observations that would become the most influential body of political thought in Western history. Scholars who've studied his manuscripts found this: the drafts of The Prince are covered in revisions. He rewrote the same passages 10 to 15 times, not because he was a perfectionist, because he had time and no illusion that anyone would read his work while he was still alive. None of this was recognized during his lifetime. He died in 1527, poor and largely forgotten. The Prince was published 5 years after his death. The Discourses came out even later. He planted seeds in a field he would never harvest. And that might be the deepest lesson of all, because most people won't do the work if the reward isn't visible, if the applause isn't audible, if the payoff isn't immediate. Machiavelli would have called that the mentality of a servant, someone who only performs when someone's watching. A person of virtue acts because the work itself is the architecture of who they are. Not because it'll be rewarded, but because without it, you're just an animal reacting to stimuli. How much important work are you putting off right now because you can't see an immediate result and you can't hear the applause? Here's life, the way Machiavelli saw it. You were born into a world that doesn't care about you. Not in a hostile way, in an indifferent way. The river doesn't hate the house it floods, it just flows. From birth, you're surrounded by people who will love you as long as it's convenient and walk away when it's not. Not because they're evil, because self-interest is the gravity of human psychology, and gravity doesn't take days off. You've been given a body that ages, a mind that lies to itself, a window of time that's shorter than you think, and half of what happens to you will be determined by forces you can't see, can't predict, and can't control. The answer to all of this, the Machiavellian answer, isn't despair. The answer is precision. Build your virtue. Not the fake discipline of alarm clocks and protein shakes. Real virtue. The ability to see the world as it is and move through it without flinching. The ability to lose everything and still have the internal architecture to rebuild. The ability to read people not as you wish they were, but as their actions prove them to be. Prepare for Fortuna. Build the levees before the flood. Develop skills that can't be taken from you. Cultivate relationships tested by time, not just ones that feel good. Save when there's no crisis, so that when the crisis hits, you don't have to beg. Accept the cycle. Your comfort is temporary. Your strength will be tested. And the moment you believe you've arrived, that's the exact moment the ground starts shifting under your feet. And above all, act. Because Machiavelli's deepest contempt wasn't aimed at villains, it was aimed at the passive, at the person who watches the world burn from a window and says, "What can I do?" At the one who's been given hands, legs, a mind, and time, and wastes all four waiting for permission. Machiavelli instructed, God wants people to act, not sit around with their arms folded waiting for a miracle. Whether you believe in God or not, the principle is deadly in its clarity. The universe punishes inaction more harshly than wrong action. At least the person who moved wrong generated data. The person who stood still created nothing. In that farmhouse in Sant'Andrea, covered in mud, drowning in debt, carrying the memory of dislocated shoulders, a man sat down every evening, put on the only dignity he had left, and built something that would outlast everyone who ever tried to destroy him. He didn't wait for the world to invite him back. He created something the world could no longer ignore. The lesson isn't about strategy. It's not about manipulation. It's not about cold-blooded power games. The lesson is this. Life will take everything it can from you. Your only move is to become the kind of person who can rebuild from whatever's left. 500 years later, his words still cut. His enemies are dust, and here you are, reading a dead man's letter from exile, feeling something stir in your chest. Don't let it fall back asleep. If this hit home, subscribe. There's a lot more coming.